Hello, this is Dean Radin, and I'm on Your Superior Self.
Hi, I'm Anita Murjani, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hello, this is Dr. Raymond Moody, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hi, Cultural Creatives. I'm Bruce Lipton, and I'm here to join you with Your Superior Self.
This is Paul Selig, and this is Your Superior Self.
What's up, everybody? I'm Aubrey Marcus, and this is Your Superior Self.
This is Marjorie Woollacott, and this is Your Superior Self.
So Marjorie, I read your book, Infinite Awareness, and I knew exactly why I needed to reach out to you. One, you're a scientist, right? But you're a scientist who is in the field of consciousness, that is studying consciousness, and isn't afraid, I don't think, anymore to talk about that, to explore that, and to write papers about consciousness, where a lot of scientists are kind of hesitant because of the materialistic side of the house, maybe looking down on that, or maybe not giving it as much credit as it should. But you are fascinating with the research that you produced and what you've written about in your book. So I just want to say thank you for taking the time.
Well, I'm excited to be here. I love the whole concept of research on consciousness and learning more about it, because, as you say, many scientists are afraid to even touch it. So when you finally find others that are willing to collaborate with you and go deeper into the understanding, you learn an incredible amount.
Well, why do you think it is, right? Is it because you can't, I don't know, what is it, falsifiability or something like that? Like you can't really, is that why scientists are kind of scared to go after consciousness?
I think they are afraid that if they go against the materialist paradigm, which we all grew up in graduate school and our early careers, that they will be basically pushed out of the herd, as they call it, of their scientific colleagues. And I think I was telling you before we even started today that I have 3 friends who are scientists who actually wrote an essay on their spiritual awakening and transformation that they had to make anonymous, because they were afraid that if their university colleagues read that and found out that they wrote it, that they would not be considered credible by their colleagues anymore. That's this odd thing we have in science, that we really believe that consciousness is only produced by the brain. And if you try to look at research that might say, well, maybe there's evidence that it might actually be fundamental and beyond just the activity of neurons, people say, please don't go there. That's impossible.
Yeah. I just think it's so fascinating, consciousness. I think it's fundamental to our reality. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, yes. I mean, and of course, when I was a young neuroscience graduate student and then a young neuroscientist, I didn't believe that. I was like all of the colleagues that we're talking about right now that said anybody that believes that consciousness is more than the activity of neurons in the brain is just weak-minded. Maybe, people often want to say, well, it's because they're afraid of death. And so this is a way that they can make it seem like they're going to actually live forever if they believe that consciousness is fundamental. That's how I was before. And then, of course, what happens is that you have a spiritual experience that wakens you to a new dimension of reality that seems more real than real. And at that point, you say, wait a minute. Was I right before? Or is there something more than I realized when I was simply believing in the materialist world being everything that there is? And that's when you begin to open yourself up curiously, with curiosity, to what evidence could there be out there that perhaps can answer those questions about whether consciousness is primary. And then, of course, you start doing research on near-death experiences, things like that. And I was shocked when I began looking at the research that's already out there in those areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talk a lot about that in your book, Infinite Awareness. You actually have some near-death experiences with doctors that were materialists, that had that mindset of empirical evidence, right? Like we need to garner support for things, and, neurons create consciousness type of mentality. But you were like that as well, right? I think in 1976 you had a meditation that changed the entire philosophy of on consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can certainly mention that. I mean, I should say that again, I was just out of graduate school and I was taking my first position as a university professor in Virginia. And my sister, who had been meditating for a couple of years, said to me, we haven't seen each other in a while. I'm going to be up in upstate New York and I'm at this meditation retreat. And for your birthday in August, I would like to give you this meditation intensive retreat. And I was skeptical. I mean, I'm a neuroscientist and I was a materialist, but I said, well, I'm still curious. And so I told her, well, sure. But she does remind me that I then backed out because my boyfriend thought that my sister was just, as he called it, a bubblehead, somebody that wasn't really, scientifically grounded. But then I said yes at the last minute. She found a place for me again. And in this meditation retreat, this meditation master came around the room, and we were told in the first meditation session that he was going to initiate every individual there. And the initiation was described as a spiritual awakening, and it was to happen through the Swami's touch. And here's where the scientist in me was skeptical. It's like, excuse me, but I was there for the weekend and I decided to put my skepticism aside and just be curious about what might happen. And so when he went around the room and he came to me, he touched me on the bridge of my nose between my eyes. And I should say my eyes were closed, but my senses were otherwise fully engaged. So I was totally aware of what was happening. And what I felt was the feeling of a mini current of electricity, like a mini lightning bolt going from his fingers to the bridge of my nose and down into the center of my chest. And I could feel the exact point where it stopped. And it was my heart, and not the physical organ of the heart, but more like a heart than my physical heart had ever felt. And this feeling inside of me began radiating from my heart, and it felt like love. It felt like nectar flowing through me and beyond me, all around me. And words came to mind at that moment. And as I say, they have nothing to do with scientific analysis. It was, I'm home. My home is my heart. This is the place that is my home. And I just felt this incredible sense of unity awareness with other people around me, with the world around me. And of course, I leave that intensive meditation program, go back to my university position in Virginia. The very next morning, I wake up at 5 a.m. and I spontaneously get up and meditate. And I've been doing it ever since. It was like something was awakened in me that was like this yearning to get back to that state of being connected to the heart. And here I am today doing research on it because it's so fascinating.
Have you ever been able to get back to that space?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one thing that I should say to everyone that meditation is a skill, and there is that moment of awakening, and then you think, oh, I'll be able to do that every day. But in fact, some days your mind is scattered and wandering, or other things are occupying your awareness and you have a harder time. But what I learned is that if I simply every morning got up and meditated for a little while, it would change the rest of my day because it would ground me. It would bring my mind to this place of stillness, this place of the heart. And then I would have a much easier time dealing with anything that happened in my day because I was coming from a place of being centered, of equanimity.
I love that. So do you think we have a baseline of this awareness? Like I've heard you talk before about there's a seed planted in all of us that is this awareness of like universal consciousness or one consciousness or the one mind. And in order to get that, you have to do or use techniques or tools like meditation or yoga to access that. Some people may experience that in their lifetime and some may not. How do we get to that baseline, or how do we get to that seed?
Well, first of all, I should say that the first thing is to be curious. If you're not curious, then it's not going to happen. But then for me, it's a matter that sometimes it's that my own everyday life seems boring enough in terms of what's going on, or it doesn't seem satisfying enough that finally there's part of me that asks, is there possibly anything more? And I think, we have like lots of songs, pop songs about that. Is that all there is? Is that all there is? And finally, a person asks that question and you begin searching. And that search then will usually end you up in one path or another that works for you at teaching you to quiet the mind down, to get toward this place of what I call heart-centered awareness, and begins to open you up to a new way of knowing. Everyone has a different path to it. I would never say there's only one path to quote unquote the truth of who you are, but it's like we each find the path that's perfect for us when we really, really, really want it finally.
When we really want it. I want it so bad, I can tell you that. and I've already committed to, I don't care how long it might take me my entire life to access that heart space or that feeling of being home in the heart. But I mean, I feel like you have to be committed, right? Like it's a long-term goal, right? Like you have to commit yourself to that.
Exactly. To me, that's the key issue, just that whole word commitment, that I got up every morning and I meditated. And I started out probably with maybe 20 minutes a day. I worked my way up to 40 minutes or 45 minutes an hour. But I think the key is that if you don't do it every day, it's just like any other skill. You won't be able to go deeper and master it. You can never become a basketball player by playing like once a month. And it's the same way with meditation. So, and one phrase that I love that my meditation teacher has said in the past is that meditation teaches you meditation. It's like you're walking down that path of meditation, and every day that you do it, you learn a little bit more about what distracts you, what brings you close to a quiet mind. And that's the key, is having that commitment.
Well, I love that you're a neuroscientist, right? Because some people meditate and they feel like nothing's happening. They do it for a year, they do it for 2 years, even though they don't see it. There's physiological changes happening, right? Like, talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the first thing I might mention is that is one very interesting study that was done by a man named Matthew Killingsworth, and it was at Harvard University, and it was simply a study where they asked people to use this particular app to ask them at any given moment in their day, were they happy or were they unhappy? That was the first part. And then whatever they said, happy or unhappy, what were you thinking about? Were you thinking about what you were doing in that moment, or you were thinking about other things? And typically, only 50% of the time were people happy. And the 50% of the time they were unhappy, it was when they were thinking about other things. And the point that he made is that you need to actually be focused in the present moment on what you are doing in order to be happy. And we don't know how in our present culture to stay focused in the present moment. So what meditation is about is teaching you to come back again and again to the present and just enjoy the present moment, what you are doing now, and keep your attention right there. And of course, what do you do in meditation? You focus on the breath. Every time you notice the mind wandering, you gently bring it back to the breath. And as you keep doing that, you find that the scattered thoughts begin to calm down. And then you begin to get closer and closer to this place of stillness and calmness and peace. And when you do that, they find that there are changes in the brain. And that is that your limbic system, the amygdala is a place of like fight or flight. It's your emotional system, begins to calm down. And your frontal cortex, which is what we call the executive system, is the area that is your wise part of your brain, begins to actually send more and more connections to quiet down the limbic system and to actually make these wonderful connections between the two, so that the limbic system is not so impulsive all the time. We don't like fly off in anger about one thing or another, because the frontal lobes are saying, hey, just take a pause, calm down for a moment to the limbic system, and then you find you can get back to center more quickly. I mean, it's a simple thing that works all throughout our day.
Fascinating. Where's the source of our ego in the brain?
A good question. I mean, so when we talk about the source of our ego, researchers have actually been looking at this very carefully, and I think it's fascinating because they say that the default mode network of our cortex of our brain, which is also called the mind wandering network, I love that term, my mind wandering network, when our mind is wandering throughout the day, is truly the source of our ego. And they're saying that because the default mode network is what creates all the stories we tell about ourselves and our roles in the world and how we relate to other people. It's that what we call the crazy friend in the back of our mind that's always talking to us. And really, we just like to get it to shut up sometimes. So that's our ego narrative. And it's often the source of all of our frustrations, because it's telling us that the particular situation we're in is not working well, or that we aren't good enough. It's doing all those sorts of judgments all the time. And what they, of course, have found is that this default mode network, this narrative of our mind, the source of our ego, is what we need to begin to quiet down as we meditate. And a number of research studies have been done. One is by Judson Brewer at Yale University that have shown that if you do meditate every day and you have somebody that's a relatively experienced meditator, when they put them into a brain scanner, a functional magnetic resonance brain scanner, they find that when they meditate, this default mode network is much, much quieter than in a brand new novice meditator that they would have like in their control group. So clearly, this egoic default mode network learns to quiet down. And when that happens, there is also an increase in your sense of connectivity with the people around you, a sense of empathy, a sense of compassion that happens exactly reciprocally. So the more the default mode network quiets down and the egoic narrative goes down, the more you have a sense of unity, awareness, of compassion, of joy in your life.
Mm. Well, you stumbled upon this type of feeling or this type of consciousness in your Kundalini experience, right? I'm assuming that's what it's called.
Yes.
Just to give some people some context, like you were, your mindset was very scientific before, your viewpoint, right? Your philosophy on life. And this experience totally transformed that philosophy into a more consciousness is fundamental to this reality. And you said that the Kundalini experience opened you to different dimensions of reality. Talk about that. Like, how did you see the different dimensions of reality and what did that look like?
Yes, I mean, so first of all, I should mention that in that very first experience that I just described earlier, I felt energy in my heart. I'd never felt energy in my heart before. I'm a neuroscientist, the heart is a muscle pumping blood. And I felt this love, this exquisite, infinite love, like pouring through me. So that was that first energetic experience. And then as I continued to meditate, I began to feel other subtle energies in my body that I had never felt before. Like between my eyes, I would feel like a pulsation between my eyes and a sense of vibrating joy. And at the crown of my head. Now, when I then began to look at literature from India and other places, in fact, they're the mystical traditions of all the world, I began to see, they have talked about this for like 2000 or more years, that there are these energy centers that happen to become enlivened when you have a spiritual awakening. And in India, it's called a Kundalini awakening. In China, it's called the Qi. In Japanese, it's called the Qi. In Christianity, it's called the Holy Spirit. So everybody has a different name, but it's exactly the same energy. And so what happened to me is in meditation, I began feeling something that my five senses had never experienced before. So that's what I was meaning by these other dimensions of reality. It's like there is an energy body within me that like interpenetrates my physical body, and it is full of joy and full of expansive sense of connection with other people and the world around me. So I think that's what I was beginning to experience. And I should say, first of all, that this was happening, for example, in my meditations in the morning, but I came to the university during the day to do my research on rehabilitation medicine, and I didn't know how to connect those two halves of my life. And so I would lead sort of a schizophrenic life. In the morning you meditate, in the evening you might go to a meditation center. And then during the day, I'm talking to my colleagues, and it just felt like I wasn't being a truly whole individual. Like I didn't know how to put the two together. And I sort of tell the anecdote about going to dinner parties with my neuroscience colleagues, and my husband would also come too. And my husband loves meditation and complementary medicine. And he would start talking about things, for example, like, homeopathy or acupuncture, just to get a kick under the table from me and my trying to change the subject, because I was so afraid of losing my credibility with my scientific colleagues, because that's the university truth, that you don't talk about those things, you don't believe in those things. So finally I said, hey, time to put the two halves of my life together. And that's when I started doing the research on meditation and beginning to look into things like near-death experiences and saying, can they help me understand what these new experiences are of energy inside of me? Can they tell me a little bit more about this reality that I've never understood before?
Well, with your experiences since 1976 and all the work that you've done and all the research and the papers and the publications, this might be a tough question to answer. How would you change the scientific framework?
I think what I would first of all simply ask is that scientists truly be curious. I think one of the things that we've noticed is that when we look at many scientists like myself that were raised with this understanding that material reality is the only reality, we are so convinced about it that if someone shows us anything they say is evidence against that, we say it can't be true. There must be something wrong with that experiment, and we won't even look carefully at it. So I think that that's the key issue, is simply saying, first of all, let me look at the research, because research has been published for the last probably 40 plus years on things like near-death experiences. And these are careful studies. I'll just give you one example. So with near-death experiences, first of all, what we are researching is to try to understand how it is that someone who comes into a hospital with cardiac arrest, their heart has stopped, and their EEG, when it's measured, is flat. So literally, they are considered clinically dead at that point. And that person, if they are then revived and their heart begins to function again, and they are interviewed after that event, they will say, well, excuse me, but while the doctor was trying to resuscitate me, I was looking with my awareness from the ceiling down on my body and down on the operating room. And I can tell you who was there, what they were wearing, what they said, how they were doing the resuscitation. And the doctor says, excuse me, that's impossible. But the point is, the person can do this. So these scientists have basically done prospective studies, which are studies where you bring in everybody with cardiac arrest into the study that comes into that network of hospitals for like a year and a half, 2 years. And then you interview them afterwards, and you have all of the data on the cardiac arrest, what their EEG looked like, and then what they say afterwards. And they see that like somewhere between 11 and maybe 20% of the people, when interviewed, say, I literally, with my heart stopped from outside of my body, could watch what you were doing, and they can verify that this is the case. So what happened to me as a materialist was that when I began reading, finally, the carefully done research studies, I couldn't deny that this seemed absolutely credible. I couldn't understand how I could say this can't be the case. I have to then assume that these physicians who are careful researchers are actually either deluded or they're telling lies, and they aren't. They're very sincere people. So there's the key issue, is like, can we be curious and can we read the literature?
So it gives power back to the subjective experience.
Yes, I think that's the key. You raised the really interesting point that as a scientist, we tend to actually put aside a subjective experience as possibly being a hallucination, your imagination, things like that. And what I think in this new era of what I would call post-materialism, where we simply try to expand materialism to include not only what I would call objective data from our scientific analysis, but also the subjective data of the person's experience, that we say, how can I actually look at the two and see how they might fit together? So let me look at the EEG and let me look at the person's experience. And then can I say what the conclusion must be if the EEG is flat and the person was totally aware? Might that give me some information about whether consciousness might be actually able to be active even when the brain is silenced in cardiac arrest?
I think this is a good segue into one of your case studies in the book. Miss Peyton, right, had a near-death experience. Can you go ahead and talk about that?
Yeah, so Bettina Peyton was an MD, and she was, in fact, having a cesarean section during the birth of her third child, because the doctors in her own hospital had said, you have a high risk pregnancy. And so they were going to do a cesarean section to try to make it a safer pregnancy in a certain sense. And so during the cesarean section, they mentioned it was going to be high risk, and she had to, in fact, have a lot of blood drawn ahead of time, so she would have liters of blood ready for her in case there were any problems. But what happened during the C-section, she says, suddenly, by the way, her eyes are taped shut, so she can't see anything, and she is under anesthesia, and suddenly she becomes wide awake and aware. And she hears the anesthesiologist saying to the doctor, how far along are you in the delivery? And he says, her blood pressure is plummeting fast. And she then just becomes like more aware than ever. And she realizes that there is a problem. And suddenly, as she hears those words, she feels a emptiness in the center of her chest because her heart has stopped beating. And at that point, she is aware that the doctor is about, or the anesthesiologist is about to slam his fist into a large red button in the wall to call the cardiac resuscitation team. But she says at that point, what happens is that even though her eyes are taped shut, she literally becomes aware of everything in the room. She can see the IV drip right above her head. She can see all that's going on, and she has a feeling she's about to die. And she says suddenly in that moment, she feels herself like actually going into this like graceful backward arc, like in the backward throes of her mind, into what she feels is this velvety blackness that is like the unknown. And she feels like, this is it, I'm leaving my body. And she says what's interesting is that she moves through this beautiful sparkly black light and space, and she feels this amazing presence there, this wise presence, and she feels like total happiness and this wonderful experience until she hears this voice that says, you must live. And it's like, in a certain sense, it was like, darn. And suddenly she is like spiraling back down into the hospital operating room. And she then sees, as she's watching the resuscitation team, she sees, first of all, the surgeon actually trying to get her body to be functional again. And just then this older surgeon with white hair comes into the room. And as they're struggling to get her heart beating, he comes over to her side. He takes his hand into her blood-filled abdomen, wraps his hand around her aorta, clamps it shut. And she says it's a very painful experience, but she knows in that moment that she's going to live. And at that point, her heart starts beating again. A nurse whispers in her ear that her daughter, that was just, in fact, delivered through the cesarean section, is a beautiful daughter and that she's going to live. And she says at that point, she then loses consciousness until she's in the recovery room. And then she's surrounded by her husband, who's an MD as well, and the whole team of doctors and nurses. And she has a trachea tube in her throat, so she can't speak, but she motions for them to say nothing and asks via just her hands, can I have something to write on? They give her a napkin and she writes on it words to this effect. I know my heart stopped. I know, in fact, my uterus is out because I did a hysterectomy, and I know I have a baby girl. And she said at that moment, she knew consciousness was fundamental. She knew she was not her body. She was something much, much bigger than that. And she goes on to mention, just something to add to it, is that her husband, who I said was also an MD, has never shifted from being an atheist and from believing that the body is the only thing that really matters. But he loves his wife dearly, and they still have a very loving, wonderful marriage, just accepting that he cannot understand how this could be. He's so immersed in his own materialist way of being. And yet she knows otherwise from her own subjective experience. And as an MD, she went on to go into hospice care because she now knew that consciousness was fundamental. And she said when she would walk into a hospice room, people could feel her lack of fear of death, and it calmed down everybody in the hospice room. Oh. And she had amazing experiences with those people that were in that transition to passing away because she knew what they were beginning to know themselves during that end of life experience.
And what is that? Is that big truth?
You know, when you say a truth, it is an experiential truth for her because her heart stopped for many minutes while they were trying to resuscitate her. She now believes it is a truth. And she said very often she could see in the eyes of the people that were dying, their own understanding that was happening to them in that moment, that they were definitely more than this body. And maybe I could just add something. There is another part of the research that I'm doing now with end-of-life experiences and also what we call after-death communication, which is communication from somebody like your beloved mother or grandmother that's on the other side that comes to you after they have died just to say, hey, everything's fine. Don't worry about me. And it's such a real experience. And often the person on the other side will give you information that you don't know and nobody else could know that's proved to be verified, that it's one more bit of evidence that consciousness does appear to actually stay totally aware beyond the moment of the heart stopping beating and the brain no longer functioning.
Man, there's so much in there I want to unpack. What is the difference between the brain and the mind?
Ah, yes. So obviously, this is the way I look at it myself now, being the neuroscientist that originally thought that the brain was the producer of consciousness. Now to saying my own understanding after doing much more research in all of these areas, including near-death studies, et cetera, is that there is obviously a connection between the mind and the brain, but it is a two-way connection. And the brain doesn't just produce the mind, the mind actually can affect the brain and the brain can affect the mind. And so, for example, I'll just give you an example. When, in fact, the person is having a near-death experience and their heart is stopped, and in that moment, the brain has stopped, the person's awareness is still totally active. In fact, most people say their awareness is clearer than it is in their normal waking state. When the heart then and the brain begin actually functioning again, that place of awareness now is able to be actually affecting the mind and the brain as the two begin to function together again, to interact together again. So I think that's one example of clearly the consciousness itself being able in some way to affect the brain. And we have then a two-way interaction between the two. And I want to say that what near-death experiences show is what people also see in two other areas, and that is meditation and also psilocybin research. And so just briefly, when people meditate, as I mentioned in that study by Judson Brewer, their default mode network becomes quieter and quieter. And literally, it's getting close to that place that people have in near-death experiences where the mind is very, very still. And when those neural circuits of the brain begin to quiet down, it's like they are filters that keep us from experiencing a more expanded consciousness. And when the filters are turned down, we now can have an awareness of our true nature, which is one of what I would call non-local awareness that is wider than what I get through my five senses.
So that the default mode network, is that what they typically use as a metaphor for well, I guess the metaphor would be the veil?
Yeah. And I should say, it's not just the default mode network. We have other parts of our brain. We often talk about the left and the right brains. And in fact, the left brain is the one that controls the right side of your body, which is your speech side of your body. It's your action side of your body. It's your linear thinking side of your body. And where you have the right side of the brain being the holistic side of the brain that sees things as a whole and is the creative side of your brain. And what we find is that left side of the brain to the right side of your body is one more filter that's making everything broken down into little pieces with your linear thinking and not being able to see the whole. So we have so many filters in our brain that are always active: our narrative mind, our left brain, also just our five senses. I mean, our five senses tell us about visual inputs, auditory inputs, et cetera, but only a tiny, tiny amount of the frequency that's actually coming in all around us. It's already giving us just a tiny taste of the true reality that's around us. So when you can turn all of those things down, what seems to happen is then your awareness can expand into this beautiful connectivity with other people around you, with, for example, in things like, I'll just bring out one more type of research, remote viewing research, where when people quiet their minds down, they can actually see things at a distance that they wouldn't be able to see, of course, with their five senses.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, remote viewing, it is legit, I think, right? There's a lot of research on that. I've heard Thomas Campbell talk about that. I mean, I've done a couple of experiments on my own that have really displayed some evidence for it. But going back to consciousness, right? Like when you start doing meditation and when you start having these experiences, have you seen a correlation in psychic phenomena, right? Like, does that increase?
It does. And I think that some people go after psychic phenomena. It's like they want to train themselves in that type of thing. And my own sense for myself anyway, is that I simply am meditating because I love the experience of connection with other people. And I love the experience of the equanimity that allows me to stay centered, no matter what is going on around me. I mean, we're right now in the midst of so many crises in the world. I mean, I think we're all aware of all these things happening around us. And it's so easy to get thrown off and become anxious all the time about what's going to happen next. And what meditation does for me is that even though I'm aware the crisis is happening, I am resilient, so I can pull myself back to center. And one of the things they say about long-term meditators is that it's not that you no longer have empathy for people that are going through difficulties or the world that's going through difficulties, but your empathy allows you to stay centered enough to actually help them, to actually come to their aid rather than wanting to run away because it's so anxiety provoking for you.
So I wonder, I'm like just curious about like, is it really mastering meditation or is it more of like a remembering of what we truly are?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, I would, of course, say that it's the second, because in fact, a lot of the studies that have been done. Now, I want to go back throughout the ages because, of course, we're pretending that meditation just was discovered recently. And of course, people have been meditating for thousands of years. And I have also done research on the texts from a part of the north of India now called Kashmir, from like the 1000s and 1100s. And there were these sages back then that talked about what you're really doing when you meditate, when you quiet the mind down, is you are recognizing who you really are. It is recognition, and you go, oh, that's who I am. And that's sort of like that experience I had in that first meditation. It's like, oh, I'm home. My heart is my home. I recognize now my true home, my true self. And so I love that understanding. It's like we've known it all along at some deep subconscious part of ourself. And suddenly in that moment, we recognize that that's who we really are. And there's a sense of, oh, yes, now I remember. And that recognition somehow makes it easier to get back to that state again and again, because we realize that is who we truly are.
I love that. What turned you on to near-death experiences, right? Like, you had that Kundalini experience and it had that awareness, right? But what turned you on to near-death?
Well, it was because as a scientist, I found that many of the things that people experience, for example, in meditation, the scientists will just say, oh, that was your imagination. Or they'll always have some reason that there could be a scientific explanation. You're just having a hallucination because you're quieting your mind down, et cetera. And the near-death experiences have what I consider to be proof that it's not just a hallucination caused by the neurons in the brain beginning to die or lack of oxygen in the brain, because the person is seeing things going on around them from a perspective outside their body. That is impossible to have in a hallucination because it is absolutely accurate. And in fact, often there are stories from these near-death experiencers that they actually then moved, for example, to a different place in the hospital and listened to the conversation of their mother and their sister over in the waiting room talking about them. And that is verified later on after they've been resuscitated. And in another case, I love this story, this particular person actually left their body and moved up through different floors of the hospital. And when they actually were resuscitated, they said, well, when I was like out of my body, I was in this strange room above the resuscitation room. And there were all of these things that looked like mannequins in there. And there were all of these electrical connections. And she said, I don't understand what that was. And then the doctor who was taking care of her said, oh my goodness, that is the room where we actually train all of our new nurses and other personnel to actually deal with cardiac arrest and resuscitation and teach them about mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and things like that. And nobody knew that room existed except for a very, very small group of the personnel. So how is it that this person that had an NDE literally became aware of that during the experience as their own awareness moved up for a while until they were resuscitated? So I think it was that drew me to doing research on NDEs. They are so convincing.
Sure. What about regular OBEs, right? Like out-of-body experiences? Is there any literature on that?
Oh, there's a lot of literature. And in fact, I find that fascinating too, because in this case, what you're saying is that the heart doesn't have to stop. The brain doesn't have to stop, but people are literally able to move into a different state of awareness and literally leave their body and move elsewhere. And in a certain sense, the remote viewing research that Stefan Schwartz and Hal Puthoff and many others at like Stanford Research Institute have done over the last, 20, 30, 40 years is doing something similar to an out-of-body experience, because the person who is being trained in remote viewing is being asked to move their awareness to a set of geographic coordinates somewhere else in the country or the world, and then to actually watch and look at what's happening in that specific spot for these geographical coordinates. And they say amazing things in detail about what's going on there. So it's very much like an out-of-body experience. And just one thing to add about that, we have no idea how this could happen. In other words, there's no mechanism that any neuroscientist or non-neuroscientist can actually identify that allows this to happen. And I think that's one reason why the materialists simply push it out of their mind. They don't even want to talk about it, because they feel that until you have a mechanism, you can't truly prove it. But my point is that if you can actually show the evidence that this happens, the evidence is enough to make us want to then understand the mechanism.
Mm-hmm. Well, what research are you working on currently?
Currently, I'm actually doing some research on terminal lucidity, which I find fascinating. So just a reminder to your audience that terminal lucidity is that time in a person's life that has, for example, Alzheimer's disease or dementia, or they're in a coma due to intractable cancer or something of that sort, and they have lost their lucidity, their clarity. And very often, for example, with Alzheimer's disease, the person doesn't recognize their relative, or they have difficulty communicating with people, or again, with a stroke, maybe somebody has gone into a coma. The terminal lucidity is when within minutes to hours before death, or in like the last day before death, they suddenly come out of that space of, in this case, like a coma, or not being able really to speak and understand. And they say with total clarity goodbye to their family. And they tell them how much they love them. They have a wonderful conversation with them. And then a few minutes to hours later, they simply die. And the reason this is so amazing is that the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's disease literally has total incurable damage from the Alzheimer's. So there's no way the brain should be able to actually support clear consciousness. And yet here you have, I think there's data by Alexander Batiani, is one of the person that's done research in this area, that about 10 to 15% of people, I believe it is, with Alzheimer's actually have this terminal lucidity where they come back to clarity. And a number of clinicians in different hospices around the world, Europe and the United States, have actually recorded these. So I'm doing research with Chris Rowe, Bruce Grayson, Michael Naum, let's see, Natasha Tassel Matamua, who is from New Zealand, a group of researchers around the world to try to understand more about terminal lucidity and begin to collect very clear evidence from clinicians about what is going on here and what it really means about our brain and our mind and how they interact in those last minutes to hours to days of life.
So the brain scans are showing what are the brain scans showing when in that moment of lucidity?
So we can't do brain scans on somebody that's basically in the last days of life, typically, because that would be invading their privacy. But what you can do is, for example, if a person does an autopsy on a person with Alzheimer's disease, you see that the brain basically is just non-functional. You can see that through looking at the neuroanatomy of the brain after they have died. And so you know that's what the brain looked like within the hours before they died. And you also know that they were totally clear because everyone in the hospital room was aware of their clarity as they were talking to them.
Okay. Have you had direct experience with that yet?
You know, I haven't had any direct experience with that. And yet I should say that one of the people on our team is basically doing work with children now. And Dr. Rohr, and what he's showing is that basically children that have sometimes like autoimmune diseases or other sorts of genetic diseases where they are going to die early, and they're sometimes 2 years old or 3 years old or whatever, there's a particular point where the doctors and the family have done everything they can to actually help them. And, maybe even transplants or things like that. And what Philip Rohr has shown is that when at a certain point, the family finally says, okay, we've done enough. Now we have to let this child go. At that point, the child may have been in a coma or simply not communicating. The child comes back and talks to the family, thanks them for everything they've done, and says, I'm going home now. And then they die. And so Philip Rohr is a pediatric oncologist, and he's doing this research. And I think it's fascinating to me that he has a few studies, and now we're trying to expand those studies, not only in children, but in adults, to find out what is really going on.
Sure. I think there's another phenomena called the shared near-death experience or something like that, where
Yes.
I think some people in hospice have experienced this when their loved one is crossing over, that they have shared that near-death experience or that crossing over with that individual. Have you heard anything about that?
Exactly. Yes. In fact, there are a few researchers that are a part of a network from the International Association of Near-Death Studies that are doing that work right now. And I think they have a new book out by it. And it is, what they have done is they have interviewed people who have had a family member, for example, begin to pass over. And they were actually able to go with that family member a certain part of the way before they were told, you have to go back. And so they could actually see, for example, the deceased relatives on the other side welcoming their mother or their father or their sister. And then they were told, okay, you go back now, and then their mother or father will go on. So they really have a sense about that shared, in fact, they call it the shared crossing project.
Oh man, I just coughed up a lung. We might have a shared near death right now. Hold on. So that to me is phenomenal. I mean, to experience that. I mean, that's why hospice care to me is so interesting to go, because I mean, yeah, you could do psychedelics, right? Like I can meditate and I can do all the steps that I think necessary to have an experience like that. But go to a hospice care unit and really see someone transitioning to the other side, and then have the possibility of having that shared experience, to me, is fascinating. I think Dr. Raymond Moody had one with his mother, and when she passed. I'm trying to think about the other cases that I've heard about, but to share that with a loved one who's crossing, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I just think that, to me, that would be fascinating to experience.
Well, and can I add something right now too? Because one of the key issues of why we want to do this research is that you can then begin to show to the hospital personnel that if we encourage the family to be with people during these last days of their life as much as possible, either let the person pass at home or in a hospice setting where the family is with them all the time, they will have more opportunities to be with the person during this very sacred and profound time. And as you say, perhaps even go partway with them. And currently, our hospitals are not designed for that, often because families are afraid of death. They actually will not even go to see their family in those last days of life because it's uncomfortable for them. And if we can just educate the hospital personnel and the families to say, this is a profound time, please try to be with your family as much as possible, because you will learn a lot more about the profound nature of consciousness by doing this.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever experienced with psilocybin to see if you could have that experience again?
I haven't. And I should say that I realize it's a very popular thing right now. The media is talking about it. There are a lot of studies going on with it. I think it's great, especially for people with terminal cancer that have a lot of anxiety about death, to actually have an experience like that, to try to help them see that in fact, they're much more than their physical body, to have a unity awareness and have this feeling of infinite love, and then come back and be able to then finish their process of dying with a whole different approach to it, feeling like, oh, I am unity awareness. I live beyond the body. It's fine. Saying that, as a meditator, I feel I would rather get to that experience myself through meditation rather than through taking a particular pharmaceutical. I feel like it's a softer, more gentle way of doing it. And because of my own experiences in meditation, I also trust it in a beautiful way. And I have beautiful experiences of total love and joy. So it's like I don't feel like I need that extra push, we might say.
Sure. Well, we're always looking for like the shortcut, right? Like
Yeah.
the quick hack to consciousness or enlightenment. And I say that, right? Like it's very enticing. It's very I mean, I could see why people do it, right? Like to experience that. But I think, through meditation and experiencing those frustrations of like not obtaining enlightenment on the first 100 tries. But I think that's a part of the path, right? I think
right. I mean, if you listen to, there are a lot of different spiritual masters around the world right now talking to us about that. And I know that Adyashanti is one, and I certainly enjoy listening to him. And also Almas is another one. And they both talk about how in meditation, what seems to be a trigger to your moving forward is actually your ego giving up to think that it can do it. What happens is that, my ego is actually my main barrier to this quiet state of mind. But the ego thinks if I just focus on the breath long enough, I'm going to be able to do it. And finally, what happens is you have to have the ego surrender and realize I can't do it myself. And suddenly when the ego surrenders and realizes it can't do it, it allows this other energy to come through. Often we talk about it as the energy of grace, but something from the universe comes in that allows us to let go of our control. And when we let go of control, we drop into the state of non-local consciousness, of unity awareness. And I just have to laugh. The ego is trying so hard to control our lives, and finally it has to surrender, and then we have the experience.
Sure. Well, it's fear-based, right? Like it's the fear of losing control and then losing that sense of identity, right? Like to lose Marjorie, right? Marjorie, evaporates or gets sucked back into the ocean, and now you're, just a drop in the ocean. Like I feel like that. I haven't had that experience yet, but I want to know if this awareness as Trey Downs stays like at my personal awareness, or is it like more expanded? I don't know.
I think it's interesting. And in fact, we were talking before we started about this book, Extraordinary Knowing, by Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer. And one of the things she said about people that were doing remote viewing in the past and other types of, when they had some sort of a psychic experience, that it often made them very, very frightened, because the ego mind is saying, how on earth did that happen? I wasn't in control. I can't figure out how I did that, but it happened. And they said it was very interesting to watch this primal fear of the ego when it's aware that there's something more out there and inside of them than it is. And I think that's fascinating. And finally, the ego just has to let go and accept that there is more to our consciousness than just our egoic narrative network that we think is always in control.
Sure. Absolutely. I think I was listening to one of your interviews, and you're talking about, I think it was some ancient Indian philosophy on consciousness. I can't remember the terminology for it or the names, but how consciousness is everything, and that is trying to know itself.
Yes. And that's Kashmir Shaivism that we just started to talk about earlier. Basically, the understanding is that non-local consciousness, the infinite awareness of the universe, they would say, the one mind with a capital O and a capital M, the one mind is out there in its potential form. And it says, wait a minute, I can't really enjoy myself just as potential. I want to actually be able to truly enjoy myself. So I am going to contract down energetically into all of the beings and the individual point awarenesses of the world, meaning all the people, all the animals, all the plants, so that I can actually have a play of understanding who I really am and get to know myself. And for some reason, I find that fascinating. For me, a very whimsical, humorous thing. And in fact, Bernardo Kastrup is one person that's talked about, in fact, all of our individual awarenesses, our point consciousness, as being something like what he calls dissociative identity disorder. In effect, like multiple personality disorder, that infinite consciousness now has gotten a multiple personality disorder by creating this entire universe with all the point awarenesses. And it's forgotten who it is. And all we have to do is, as you say, recognize that we are the one awareness, and then let go of thinking we are only this point of awareness, and seeing that we're the point and we're also the infinity. We are connected to everyone.
I love that. It's beautiful. I just have to ask you this question: with all the research that you've done in near death and consciousness, are you afraid of death?
No. I say that in this moment, I'm not afraid of death. It doesn't mean that if somehow I were in an airplane and I could see that it were spiraling down because it had lost its engines, I might not, I imagine that my heart might be going, oh my goodness. At the same time, there is a feeling that when it's my time to die and pass over, I will do that. And because I've also read a lot of research on cases suggestive of reincarnation, I could imagine that maybe my own spirit might come back and re-inhabit another body, but I have a sense of continuity, and that we're here to learn. We are that infinite consciousness that's come into a point of awareness to learn more about ourselves, and it's an ongoing journey. And so, yeah, my body will last so many years. Everybody's dies, and we move on to the other side. And then if we want to have a little bit more of that experience, we can come back again, or perhaps we can stay on the other side for a while and even maybe help guide people from the other side. We talk about perhaps wise beings from the other side that might be spirit guides or something like that. I have no idea if it's true, but I have a sense that this world is much bigger and more mysterious than we realize. And if we can just begin to enjoy the play of it and not take it quite so seriously, we can find an incredible joy in our interactions with others in the world.
I love it. Marjorie, thank you so much for this. This has been fascinating. How can people find out more about you?
Well, I have written this book, Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, which is right here. And they can also go to my website, which is marjoriewoollacott.com. And on my website, I have many of the podcasts that I have actually given, and also many of my papers, my research papers. And they can also look up those things. And so they can learn a little bit more about it if they're curious.
I think it's over 200 publications. I think it is.
Yes, over 200 publications. And that's both in regular neuroscience and rehabilitation, and then also now on consciousness and its actual nature and reality.
I love it. Marjorie, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing this experience with me.
Thank you. It's been wonderful, Trey.